Whenever we post our truths in regards to our plight and condition on social media platforms, there's often some white person who posts a comment essentially telling us to shut up and just get over it. None of our legitimate grievances are ever deemed as legitimate or credible by the white society. They instead constantly accuse us of victim peddling. But the truth of the matter is that white people have been telling black people to shut up and get over it from the day slavery was abolished in 1865. Speaking and sharing black liberating truth amongst ourselves has always been forbidden by the white society because they never wanted us collectively gaining a clear and accurate understanding of our plight and condition that's necessary in order to develop the proper counter strategies to liberate ourselves. This is why they have millions of us believing the falsehood that a Bible written by history's proven most ungodliest group of people and that was brutally beaten into the blood-soaked minds of our ancestors ridiculously contains the true words of God that will now set us free. It's also why they have millions of us now believing the falsehood that we African Americans are not from Africa, but are instead the true indigenous Americans, although countless millions of DNA analysis have scientifically proven our African identity. It's also why they have many of us believing that we're being controlled by a silly slave syndrome myth, which presents what would in fact be the least effective method used for controlling generations of people. None of these noted beliefs makes any sense at all, and they keep millions of black people functioning as wardens of their own mental prisons. Those black people who don't critically think never notices their mental chains. The white society keeps us believing falsehoods in regards to our plight and condition because doing so keeps all of our liberating remedies and strategies also flawed. They don't want us ever gaining an accurate understanding of our plight and condition. This is why whenever we post any information on social media platforms that has the potential of elevating our people's collective understanding of our plight and condition to a more accurate one, Facebook blocks it, Twitter deletes it, Google hides it, YouTube bans it, and the media censors it, and the government forbids it. Fortunately, some of us are born with a spiritual immune system that allows us to see the truth that so many of us are oblivious to. Throughout generations, our ancestors have always provided us with those they've given the spiritual insight to see through the oppressor's maze of lies and confusion. Those of us that are bestowed with this gift of insight must share the knowledge. Those who know must teach, African proverb. Hear the truth of our plight and condition that we need to know in order to develop the proper counter strategies that are necessary in order to liberate ourselves. Unlike at the conclusion of World War II, when the Jewish Holocaust ended and the US and the UN contributed massive financial support to rebuild the lives of the Jews, there was no moral obligation to do the same for we Africans. Although the African Holocaust lasted hundreds of years longer, resulted in millions of more deaths, and more greatly decimated the African culture, when slavery was abolished, America, Great Britain, and the many other white nations that benefited from the brutal exploitation of Africa felt no moral obligation to restore the African culture. And they instead focused on their own self-interest. The white society's exploitation of Africans has provided it with an era of which it has flourished most throughout history. Therefore, to allow this era to end would be directly against the interests of the white society, especially given that the white society's dependence on Africa's natural resources is indefinite. Therefore, when the white society's exploitation and subjugation of black people became no longer socially acceptable with the changing times and resulted in unprecedented unified black protests, white oppressive forces did not abandon their practices of subjugating and exploiting black people. They merely developed more covert methods for continuing to do so. And they've socialized the minds of black people to think in ways that allows the white society to continue its exploitation and subjugation of black people without any black resistance. The African slaves of the 21st century are those who cannot overcome their socialized mind. Socialized is when the oppressors exploits their monopoly over information that are systematically fed into the collective minds of the oppressed to manipulate the oppressed to think and behave in ways that serves and protects the interests of the oppressors. White social scientists describe the nefarious practice as merely instilling a value system into the collective minds of the subordinate black population that makes us adhere to the authority and existing infrastructure of the white dominant culture. There are 4 ways to effectively socialize an entire generation of people: by what they are taught, by what they see, by what they hear, and through repetition. Because the white society controls the education we're taught, the media images we see, and the societal narratives that we repetitively hear, white oppressive forces exploits these factors to covertly socialize the collective minds of black people to think in ways that benefits the white society without most of us even realizing it. It's how the white society secretly protects itself from massive unified black retribution and continues its subjugation of black people. The socializing process first began during our early education development, when our minds are young and most impressionable, through a whitewashed educational curriculum that withholds virtually all black racially affirming facts from black students throughout their entire education development. This psychology conditioned black students to grow up perceiving ourselves through a false, inherent, inferior identity that aids the white society in maintaining its social dominance over black people, because it makes us more compliant with their white dominance over our lives. The socializing process is also reinforced unrelentingly throughout our entire life through constant fraudulent media propaganda that keeps black people believing the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. This demoralizes us, divides us, creates black self-loathing, and shifts black collective aggressions away from the white society and redirects it against ourselves. It also attacks the core foundation of what bonds us as a people, and we can then be ruled over forever. The socializing process, this is the true hidden reason why many black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of a brutal history to the contrary. It's always by the deliberate design when the oppressed starts thinking exactly as the oppressors wants them to. When this happens, it's always because the oppressed have been socialized to do so. We've also been trauma bonded to the white society. The term trauma bonded relationship is usually associated with an individual abusive relationship wherein which an abused person is trauma bonded to a narcissistic abuser. Here's how it's achieved. After repeatedly brutalizing the victim, the narcissistic abuser never acknowledges any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells the victim that the abuse wasn't that bad and to get over it. He then constantly inundates the victims with demoralizing and disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abuse and instead focus only on the demoralizing and disapproving narratives. Therefore, rather than resenting the abuser for abusing them, the victim instead focus only on winning the approval of the abuser. He tries to win the approval. That's what he focuses on. This trauma bonding effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome rather than having the victims resenting and hating them. It's a gaslighting tactic. Likewise, the same trauma bonding abusive manipulation tactic is what the white society has done to black people. After brutalizing black people for many centuries, the white society never acknowledged any of the abuse, the horrible things they did to black people throughout history. They instead insist that abuse wasn't that bad and tell black people to get over it. Then they constantly inundate black people with demoralizing propaganda, disapproving propaganda about ourselves. Therefore, rather than black people resenting the white society, many black people tries to win the approval of the white society. Many black people go out of their way to show white people we're not all bad, This is what's been done to us. We have been trauma bonded to the white society in the same manner. This has continued until rather than resenting the white society for abusing us, many black people just goes out of their way. They want white approval. They want white approval. This is our hidden reality. Many black people goes out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. I'm not like the rest of them. This is the truth of our plight and condition. Black people have been trauma bonded. We are in a trauma bonded relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most abusive relationships, the white abusers have convinced many black people to believe that the abuse we endure was our own fault. So instead of resenting them, we instead seek the white society's approval. It's a psychological mind hack. The minds of targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate if they're unaware of what's been done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense, and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. Now you know the truth of our plight and condition. The truth has finally come forward, but millions of black people have been conditioned to fear it and to hate those of us who teach it. Millions also refuse to accept the truth because of the inherent call for action that comes with accepting the truth. Many therefore cling to believing in their biblical fairy tales and the silly slave syndrome myth that keeps our minds dumbed down and confused and mentally enslaved to the benefit of the white society. Nothing is being done to address what's being done to us because we no longer have true black leaders. We only have the black puppets who actually works for the white establishment. Now you know what the true black people's matrix is. Those of us who will tell you the truth are trying to free you from a mental prison that you don't even know you're trapped within. Welcome to the real world.